Why does the most advanced aircraft carrier ever built still load its bombs by hand? Not a museum piece, not a holdover from a cheaper era. Today, on the USS Gerald R. Ford, $13 billion of electromagnetic catapults, linear motor elevators, and radar arrays that see beyond the horizon. The final step before a weapon reaches the wing of a strike fighter is a sailor turning a steel ratchet. The engineers did not forget to replace it. They spent years and billions trying. Then the ship went to sea, and the ocean started moving. Every precision system the Ford was built around began its argument with the sea. The ratchet is not in that argument. It never needed the ocean to hold still. This is Navy Decoded. We are going inside that ratchet, and inside the most expensive argument in the history of American naval engineering. To understand why that ratchet is still turning by hand, we need to go back to the promise. The promise was a number, 270. 270 combat sorties in 24 hours. That was the surge requirement written into the Ford-class design. The Nimitz class, the workhorse of American naval aviation for half a century, could sustain about 120 sorties a day. The Ford was supposed to more than double that. To hit 270, the Navy made a single bet. They traded mechanical compliance for electromagnetic precision. The steam catapults, the workhorse of every American carrier since the 1950s, gave way to electromagnetic launchers that could fine-tune their pull to each airframe. The hydraulic cables that had caught landing jets for half a century were replaced by software-managed water twister rotors. The cable-driven elevators that hauled ordnance up from the magazines became linear motor elevators sliding on machined rails. Faster, cleaner, more precise. But precision has a hidden requirement. A guide rail machined to thousandths of an inch only works if the rail stays where the design said it would. A linear motor only delivers its calibrated pull if the geometry holds. Every one of those electromagnetic systems was built around the same assumption, that the structure carrying them would hold still. The one variable the Navy could not engineer away was the ocean itself. And the ocean's argument doesn't end at the catapult. But sortie rate is not just a launch problem, it is a logistics problem. You can catapult an aircraft into the sky every 45 seconds, but if the bomb is not on the wing, the sortie does not count. SGR is a chain. Every link has to clear faster than the launcher fires. The catapult upgrades got the headlines. The thing that actually had to keep pace was the weapons flow, magazine to deck to wing. And that flow runs through systems most viewers have never heard of. The ocean had a different idea about every one of them. The original weapons elevators on the Nimitz were hydraulic. Thick steel cables, hydraulic rams, mechanical catches. They hauled ordnance up from the magazines. Belts of cannon shells, 500-pound bombs, full torpedoes, at whatever speed the hydraulics could manage. They were slow. They demanded constant maintenance. The cables stretched. The hydraulic fluid leaked. The mechanisms jammed. None of that ever once stopped a Nimitz-class carrier from surging. The Ford's 11 advanced weapons elevators were supposed to fix all of that. Linear synchronous motors, the same technology inside the electromagnetic catapult, replaced the cables entirely. Instead of a mechanical drum winding a steel cable, electromagnets embedded in the guide rails push and pull the elevator car directly. No moving parts of the drive mechanism, no hydraulic fluid, no cables to stretch. The engineering promise was clean: faster cycle time, higher reliability, less maintenance. On paper, the AWE was everything the hydraulic elevator was not. The problem lives inside the tolerance window. A linear synchronous motor works by maintaining a precise gap between the magnets in the guide rail and the magnetic receiver on the elevator car. That gap is not a suggestion, it is a calibration. The motor is tuned to it. The sensors that verify alignment are set to it. The software that authorizes movement checks it before every cycle. The entire system was designed around one assumption. That gap stays exactly where the dry dock drawing said it would be. A 100,000-ton steel hull does not stay where the drawing said. Engineers call it hogging and sagging. When the bow rides up a wave as the stern falls behind, the hull bends. Bow and stern rising, midship flexing downward. When the wave passes and the bow drops, the hull bends the other way. The movement is not dramatic, a few inches at the center line. The eye cannot see it from the flight deck. But an elevator shaft runs from the lowest magazine to the flight deck through every structural frame in between, and every frame that flexes takes a section of guide rail with it. When the rail moves outside the tolerance window, the sensors fire. Not just on the elevator in the affected frame, on every elevator indexed to that structural section. The interlocks engage. The cars stop. No override. No manual bypass. The software holds the system until the hull returns to within tolerance. The magazines below have no idea. The flight deck above has no idea. The ordnance flow simply stops. On the Ford's first deployment, the weapons department ran over 11,000 elevator cycles and moved nearly 2 million pounds of ordnance. The crew earned that number. But 11,000 cycles across a 7-month deployment is deliberate operations, a tempo the crew controls. In sea states they can manage around. Surge is different. 270 sorties in 24 hours means the elevators cannot stop. The flight deck demands continuous flow, and the Pacific Ocean does not adjust its weather to the surge schedule. The Nimitz's hydraulic elevators never experienced a hull flex shutdown. Not because the Nimitz hull did not flex. It did, the same hogging and sagging through the same Pacific swells. But a cable follows the geometry. When the shaft bends, the cable bends with it. The load moves whether the hull is straight or not. A cable does not have a tolerance window to exceed. The Ford traded that compliance for precision. The precision has one condition. The ocean has never once agreed to meet. The electromagnetic systems failed. The interlocks triggered. The bombs stopped moving through the elevators. And somewhere on the flight deck above, a red shirt picked up his ratchet and kept cranking. He didn't know the elevator was down. It didn't matter. His system doesn't have software interlocks. It never did. This is why the hand crank is still here. And the reason is physics, not preference. The physics comes down to one number, JP5. The standard aviation fuel aboard every carrier has a flash point above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Flash point is the temperature at which fuel vapor becomes ignitable. At the final connection point, where a steel weapon is being hoisted toward an aircraft with fuel residue in every seam and vapor in every breath of deck air, any electrical arc crosses that threshold. A motor brush, a hydraulic fitting with a leak path, a connector making intermittent contact under load. Any of these, once, ends the aircraft. The Navy's answer is the answer physics gave. No electric motor, no hydraulic pump, nothing that can arc at the last step. Only human hands. That means 3 aviation ordnancemen, red shirts, push an MHU-191M cart across the flight deck to the aircraft. The cart is unpowered, 5,000 pounds safe working load, moved by feet and shoulders. No motors. The deck is pitching. There is jet exhaust and wind and salt spray cutting across the flight line. They push anyway. At the aircraft, they lower the HLU-288E, a hand-cranked ratchet hoist, clip it to the wing pylon, and spool the cable down to the weapon. Steel safety straps are cinched around the weapon before the crank turns. One of them cranks. A 1,000-pound bomb rises on a free-swinging cable while the others keep hands on it, the deck moving beneath all of them. The geometry is exact, and the ocean will not hold still for it. A 1,000-pound weight on a cable, on a deck pitching through 6 degrees, is a pendulum. The period of its swing is set by cable length. The amplitude is set by the ocean. 2 steel lugs, each about the size of a fist, have to slide into the hooks of the ejector rack on the wing pylon. The ordnanceman doesn't fight the pendulum. He reads it, waits for the rhythm the sea is writing, times the alignment, slides the lugs home, locks it. Then the umbilical munitions connector, the data cable that programs the JDAM's target coordinates. A salt-fouled pin, a wet contact, and the cockpit reads, hung weapon. The sequence restarts from the beginning. It is slow. It is hard. It is physically brutal. By hour 12 of a surge, the muscles burn and the rhythm slips. The crew rotates. The carts keep moving. This window, from cart to locked weapon, fits inside a 15 to 20-minute aircraft turnaround. Ordnance is one piece of that clock. The crew works it every day, surge or not, in conditions the electromagnetic systems were designed around, but only sometimes survive. The hand crank has exactly one failure mode. The sailor stops cranking. Since the first carrier strikes of World War II, that has not happened. Not once because an interlock fired. Not once because a hull flexed. The hand crank survived everything the Ford threw at it. Software failures, electromagnetic shutdowns, Sea State 5. The F-35C is already flying from Nimitz-class carriers. The Ford class is next, scheduled to begin that integration following a 2-year planned availability period. When it arrives on that flight deck, the hand crank's job gets harder. Not because the crank changes, but because the aircraft does. Loading an F/A-18 Super Hornet is the workflow we just described. Cart to wing. Crank the weapon up, align the lugs, lock it. Hard work on a moving deck, but the geometry is straightforward. The weapon travels up, through open air, to a pylon on the underside of a fixed wing. Loading an F-35C is the same workflow, run backwards, because the weapons go inside. That is the price of stealth. Every external pylon, every hardpoint, every weapon hanging in open air is a radar reflector. A radar return is a location signature, the opening move in an engagement the F-35C was specifically designed to avoid. So the weapons go inside an internal bay. Clean radar cross-section, better survivability in a contested environment, the right call for the mission the jet was built for. But survivability math is calculated in a design lab. Arming math is calculated on a pitching deck. Inside that internal bay, mounted to the ceiling, is the BRU-68A, a pneumatic ejector rack running at 5,000 psi designed to kick a weapon clear of the airframe at release. To load it, the ordnanceman doesn't just hoist a weapon up. He first cranks the rack down from the ceiling to deck level, attaches the 2,000-pound J-dam to the rack on the ground, then cranks the entire assembly, weapon and rack together, back up into the internal bay and mates it to the aircraft's pneumatic system. The same hand, the same ratchet, significantly more steps. The spark hazard does not change because the aircraft changed. JP5 flashpoint is the same inside an F-35C weapons bay as it is under an FA-18 wing. No electric motor at the final connection point, regardless of aircraft type. The Ford's precision systems fail because the ocean will not hold still for them. The hand crank survives because it never asked the ocean to. The F-35C, the most precision-engineered aircraft ever placed on a carrier deck, added steps to the only system that was already working. The jet got more capable. The ordnanceman just got more tired. We started with a question. The most advanced aircraft carrier ever built. $13 billion. Electromagnetic catapults that tune their energy to each airframe, radar arrays that track aircraft 300 miles out. Why is the final step still a sailor turning a ratchet by hand? 3 systems, 3 failure modes, 1 answer. At the final connection point, weapon to wing, every surface carries fuel residue. Every breath of deck air carries vapor. Any electrical arc crosses the JP5 flashpoint. Any motor, any hydraulic fitting, any powered component at all. Physics has drawn a line at 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and no budget in the history of naval procurement has ever moved it. The engineers knew this. They spent years on it. Robot arm proposals, powered hoist concepts, automated handling studies. Every one of them terminated at the same wall. The solution space has exactly one occupant, a sailor, hands on steel, turning a ratchet the same way ordnancemen turned it on fleet carriers in 1944. Every piece of technology on the Ford was engineered, tested, documented, and transferred into the ship through procurement contracts and technical specifications. You can read the tolerances. You can audit the calibration records. You can reset the software. The skill in that ratchet does not transfer that way. It lives in the weapons department, passed from petty officer to seaman, rebuilt every deployment, calibrated against the actual sea, not a simulation of it. There is no technical manual that captures the exact moment a 1,000-pound pendulum is ready to lock. That knowledge exists only in the hands. It has to be earned on a moving deck, under load, in the wind. The Ford is not a failure of engineering. It is the exact boundary where engineering ends. The electromagnetic systems, the linear motors, the precision software, all of it runs to the edge of what physics permits and stops. The ratchet is what lives on the other side of that line. It always has. The Ford is not more capable than the Nimitz. It is more precise. On a calm day in port, those are the same thing. On day 3 of a surge in the Pacific, they are not. The ocean didn't leave the hand crank behind. The ocean made it mandatory. Navy Decoded exists for this kind of question, the one where physics writes the answer before the budget committee meets. If that's how you want to see the world, subscribe. We'll keep following the engineering. And here is the next one worth asking. The Navy is now spending money to study how to automate ordnance handling on future carriers. Robots instead of red shirts, guided carts instead of manual pushes, powered hoists in place of ratchets. If you build a robot that loads bombs, a robot with sensors, software, and precision tolerances, what happens when the ship rolls in sea state 5? When the hull flexes through a swell? When the salt spray fouls a connector the way salt spray has fouled connectors on every carrier since the steam catapult era? The hand crank doesn't have that problem. It never did. The question is not whether we can automate the last manual step on the Ford. The question is whether we should.